So I'd also like to thank we had some elected officials and some city and county officials who signed up. I'm not sure I see anyone in person right now, but thanks for those people. And I want to thank the representatives of the various environmental organizations that are active in the area. Some of you I know are in the room, some might be on Zoom. Again, thank you for your participation. So the program is going to focus tonight on the presentation by Dr. P. Ruess of George Mason University, his presentation or their presentation on the Virginia Climate Assessment, which is the first official state assessment for the climate. Other states, by no means a majority of the states, but other states in the country have published state climate assessments. And of course, there was a national climate assessment until 2000. Well, the latest one was in 2023. And when the Trump administration came into office, they suspended basically they removed the publication from the website of NOAA. There is I'll mention this, and we'll send out this link after the meeting, but there is an organization that has copied the 2023 National Climate Assessment, and so you can access it through that organization. We'll put that link out after the. So part of this presentation, part of the question and answer session following it is going to be basically I'll ask Dr. Royce, what are the connections? How does the state assessment complement the national assessment? And so we'll get into that in the question and answer session. And by the way, that question and answer session, once the presentation starts, start putting your questions in the chat function. And we'll take questions from the in-person audience and then we'll alternate that with questions from the chat. I don't think we're going to have a lot of time. We might have some time for a member group update. So during the general meetings of Cville100, we allow we make space for area environmental organizations to discuss what they have done recently and what they're planning to do on the environmental front in the area. Hopefully we'll have some time for people the in-person audience as well as people on chat to maybe send in updates on what they've been doing. Mentioned that in July and August, we tentatively scheduled presentations by first in July, Eric Curran of Secure Solar Futures talking about solar legislation that made it through the General Assembly this year. And then in August, sort of tentatively, but hope to have Jamie Powers of the county climate staff talk about what the climate situation or climate action situation is in the county government. But at this point, I think I'm going to let the other co-chair of Cville100, the recently elected Annette Oso, introduce our speaker.
All right, thanks, Peter. Now we put on the owl. Am I okay here? It should be picking. Yeah, for the virtual posts?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, Annette Oso here then, just as Peter said, now the new co-chair. So looking forward to this public meeting and other public meetings now that there's something new we'd like to do more of to help get the word out about the climate change situation, what the city and county are doing, what can we do at both the local and state level. So it's an important role we community members have here at this point in time. I just want to take a minute to just note that this school is 100 years old now from 1926. It was this building was constructed as Jefferson High School and became one of the first and the few accredited high schools for Black students in Virginia. So there were other buildings previous, but this whole site was constructed, and it's now 100 years old. So the good news is it's been being repurposed for multiple things besides the African Heritage Center, I believe is what it's called, of recounting the Black history in this area, but also community college and childcare and all kinds of things going on here. So it's great to see the building being put to good use in multiple ways and really being an active part of the community. And thank you all, Sage and Kimberly, for allowing the community room here to be open and free to these nonprofit organizations. So with that, let me introduce our speaker, Dr. P.J. Ruess, and he is they are a postdoctoral research fellow at the Virginia Climate Center, George Mason University. So this is really exciting because they are one of the primary authors of the Virginia Climate Assessment, and it's really significant that we now have something as a baseline, scientifically constructed document that says, it documents what's going on around the state in all regions of the state. So I will let them tell you more details, but just a minute on the background. So Dr. Ruess was at University of Virginia, just in case folks are wondering, and got his bachelor's in science in civil engineering, master's in science at the University of Texas at Austin in flood forecasting and emergency response, so very relevant, and then a PhD in water, food nexus, and water resources management from University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So very important topics, all of them. You're our new expert. I've decided. So with that, I will ask you to come forth and assume we are having good audio, right, with the virtual folks. Okay.
You can turn it on.
You mute your volume.
Turn your volume down.
Oh, no.
The TV decides it wants to turn on, you decide by itself.
You just turn off the volume and say if you catch it coming out of the computer.
So you want me to be turned off? I need to be turned off.
No, the sound coming out of it.
Yeah, just mute.
Look at yourself here.
Okay.
Not muting in the chat. So see the sounds. Yeah. Even let's just see things. Okay.
Oh, you're good?
I think so. Am I being captured by the video? Being captured by the video? Also, heads up for everybody here, there's this camera over here that I'm kind of talking to, so that feels weird. I'm going to probably talk to it, but I have to also look over here so that I don't know about you the entire time I'm speaking. So I'll be jumping back and forth, and I'll do my best. But thank you for the great introduction. You actually covered a lot of my preliminary talking points, so I'll try to speed through the slides and keep this here as little as possible. But yeah, I'm Dr. Ruess, and I'm going to be talking about the Virginia Climate Assessment, and this is not going to be very big to me. I am one of the lead coordinating authors, but there were many people, I'll show that also on a slide, that contributed to this work. Next slide, I guess I have to say that, so I'm going to forget to say that. So some context, I am technically employed by George Mason University, but I also work for the Virginia Climate Center. The Virginia Climate Center is a climate extension service that partners with Virginia stakeholders to offer advisory services and co-produce locally relevant data products on an as-needed basis. So we're a NOAA-funded project. We've been in place for about 3.5 years now. And the idea here is to be sort of equivalent to an ag extension service, but we're doing climate-focused data and so we're not necessarily working with farmers, we're working more just with municipalities or tribes or whoever might have questions about climate. Next slide. And then why do we need a climate assessment? Peter, I think you were going to ask me a question about this, but I might already have the answer for you. So firstly, we have federal climate assessments, right? The National Climate Assessment we're on the 5th installment that came out in 2023. The 6th installment we were hoping to get in 2028 it's now in a sort of a limbo state based on the current administration. We're not really sure what's going to happen to it going forward. And then many states do have climate assessments. Here's an example. Nebraska, for example, had a climate assessment that came out in 2024.
Virginia, we did not have any climate assessment until this one that we just published last year. And we also are shockingly one of only 2 states in the entire US that does not have a state climate office. So another motive for us is that state climate assessments are kind of, in our minds, the responsibility of a state climate office. But because we don't have one of those, we sort of took this up to say, here's sort of at least a baseline we can create, and hopefully use that to motivate the establishment of a climate office going forward that could then maintain this momentum that we built. And then here's another little point here is that the National Climate Assessment, they focus on 6 or 7 different climate regions across the US. And I think this is a good motive also for a Virginia State Climate Assessment being so important, is that we are on the northeasternmost tip of this Southeast and Caribbean group. We're part of the Caribbean group. So this means that our climate is grouped in with Puerto Rico, with Florida, and with Louisiana. And I think that that sort of begs the question that maybe we could do a little bit more looking at us specifically because we're on the cusp here. Instead of looking at the entire region in aggregate, I think we're losing out a little bit by being on the edges. So some sort of background stats of the climate assessment itself. This is a science-based evaluation of climate in Virginia. We did not do any new work for climate. We're just looking at the state of the science. We're looking at publications and compiling all that information so that we have this in one place across the entire Commonwealth. This was a 6-month effort, which is an extremely short timeline. We did this from April to October of last year, including the review cycle. So very short timeline. It's the first report of its kind in Virginia, and as I mentioned, it's good as a baseline so that we can measure, compare future changes to it, and also so that we can now evaluate things like adaptation effectiveness going forward. As of December, I know this is old, we had 1,500 web visits, 205 downloads. That number has grown. I don't know exactly what it is to tell you a number for today. And the document itself is 90 plus pages. Our initial goal was to write a 30-page document, so we had a lot of scope creep. Totaling 9 chapters with 26 contributing authors from 8 academic institutions and nonprofits, and 14 reviewers from academic institutions, nonprofits, and local governments, 12 of those. And in total, there were 327 research projects that were evaluated and that contributed to this document. Now, very briefly, just looking at, should I be speaking a little bit louder or anything? Did everybody say anything? Okay. Very briefly, I just wanted to show, these are all of the contributing authors. The lead authors, there are 4 of us, we are all at George Mason University. This is, I think, a weakness of this first climate assessment, is that we are predominantly out of George Mason. We did our best to reach out to many institutions. You will notice University of Virginia is not on here. That is not for lack of trying. There were some university politics that come into play with these things, and so they were not actually any co-authors, but we did actually reach out to quite a few people at University of Virginia to see if they might contribute. Then we had a bunch of lead authors where we had a little bit more diversity, and a lot of contributing authors where we additionally had, for example, Jeremy Hoffman at Groundwork USA, and the 3 at the bottom at CCS. Those are some nonprofit contributors. Next slide. And then these are all of our reviewers, where we did have a couple from George Mason, but we tried to get this at least a little bit more spread out to the best of our ability, and also have not so many from academia, but also some from like the New York City Mayor's office. This person, Haley's on there because she has experience with climate assessments in the state of New York. So we thought she'd be good as a reviewer, right? And then we also have people from like Fairfax County and stuff like that. Okay, next slide. Now, the document, because it's 90 pages, this is the sort of biggest zoomed out version of what we talk about. There's an executive summary, it's 2 to 3 pages, sort of very high level highlights for busy readers, right? Initially, this was born as we need something that the politicians will actually read, and then we expanded it out to be, okay, it doesn't have to be just politicians, but just so that people who don't have the time can have a quick information. We then go into an introduction where we look at sort of this preface to the document itself, background info, and then also a sort of big picture sum of Virginia's climate takeaways, before we finally dive into what's sort of 8 sub-chapters that really are the meat and potatoes of the document. So we go into Virginia's climate, where we talk about temperature, precipitation, and sea level, so that's sort of like state of climate. After that, we talk more about the implications and the impacts, so heat risk, flood risk, drought risk, compound risk, and then finally we look at exposure to climate hazards, which is like economic exposure. I do want to call out briefly that I looked over, you have the Albemarle County recently in 2022 published a climate assessment sort of equivalent at the smaller scale locally. It's a very, I think, in some ways a more detailed document than ours, but it's very local. You had a couple things that we don't have, which we know we don't have. wildfire and pests like ticks. We don't have those two. We just didn't have the ability to do all that. We didn't have people that we could call on that we thought would be specialists in those areas to lead those chapters. So we're very hopeful and we're aware that that is a gap. And we're hoping that, future iterations, we will prioritize that kind of information as well. And then finally, we have these references. It's traceable accounts, glossary citations. This is in keeping with National Climate Assessment formatting. Traceable accounts, I think, might be the only thing some of you are unaware of. It's basically paragraph form references that have the actual citations within them, because the main body of the text doesn't have the references within it. So this is our way of saying, okay, you read the stuff that we said. If you want a little more detail and you want to really know where that came from, you have the references in the form of these paragraph style traceable accounts for every single section of the document. There's a bunch of little facts about Virginia on the left here at the big scale, but the main thing I want you to focus on here is the right side. This is again a sort of a limitation of this study, is that we would have loved to have done this at county scale or scales that are smaller so we could really get more detailed information. But in our initial literature review, we found that there actually isn't enough information for all of our climate variables and all of the things that we're interested in to do that. So we ended up zooming out instead to 6 climate divisions within the state of Virginia. I'll go over this again on a later slide, but Albemarle is right at the top of that Western Piedmont section. So that is your climate division. And that is, I think we did a good job doing this. This is what we had available. But I'm hoping that this also serves as maybe a call to action for people to do research at smaller scales so we have a little bit more to talk about in future similar assessments as well. Okay, big picture, 6 sort of big takeaways of the entire assessment. Temperatures are increasing. I'm sure none of these are going to be surprising to most people in this room, but temperatures across the Commonwealth are increasing, particularly in cold seasons. Virginia is also getting wetter, right? More frequent. So we're getting rain happening a lot more often, but we're also getting more intense events. So it's raining more when it does rain. Sea level has also been rising in Virginia. We have actually some of the highest rates of sea level rise in the entire world. Of course, that doesn't impact you all because you're not coastal, but a lot of Virginia is coastal, and Norfolk especially is getting hit very hard by sea level rise. Drought is also an increasing concern. I know we don't always think about the eastern part of the US as being drought prone, but we do actually have a fair bit of drought, and it's getting worse. Compound climate events are also important. This is, for those unaware, compound climate events is basically when something happens in the climate, it leads to something else. So we have, for example, power outages, right? Storm happens, it might put out the power grid. That might then have impacts on like cooling, right? So all these things are end up being very interlaced. That's sort of what compound climate events captures, and we have a lot of them. And then finally, I think this is almost comedic. Every single one of Virginia's economic sectors is sensitive to climate change. Nobody is free. Everybody's being impacted, period. All right, yes, next slide. So now I'm going to go over each of those like 8 or 9 chapters very briefly. So each of the chapters are structured such that we have 3 key messages that are roughly 25 words, which is what you're going to see on these slides. These are all supported by some paragraphs of information, which are then supported by the traceable accounts within the main document. And I'm not going to touch on all these in all in the most detail. I'm going to try to go fairly quick. So basically, here, one of the most interesting takeaways, I think, so temperatures increasing across the board. But I think it's very interesting that coldest days are actually warming more quickly than our warmest days. So for me, this is actually very salient, because if I think, oh, the summer, it's getting so hot, it feels so gross compared to what it used to feel like. Take that feeling and then put it in winter, because actually it's getting hotter faster in the winter across Virginia. And I think that's really interesting, right? And that's also leading to like less snow, right? I think if anybody's been here for a while, you can tell that we're getting a lot less snow than we used to get. I think that's really sad. I love snow, but we are getting a lot less snow. It's very much warming across the board in Virginia, especially in cold months. And the last point basically just says that we're seeing statistically significant increases across the entire, across all range of emission scenarios. So you do best case scenario, you do worst case scenario, we're still getting temperature increases. Precipitation is complicated, as really all that first slide says, but then if we're looking at precipitation, like I mentioned, it's wetter overall across the entire Commonwealth. More frequent rainfall, which means we're getting more rainstorms. And then when it does rain, it pours. We're getting more intense rain. So it's more peaky. Like instead of like sort of gradual, smaller storms, we're getting lots of short and intense storms. And then some information about some areas, spring and fall are especially getting wetter, particularly in the coastal regions, the southwest or southeastern part of the state in particular. And summers are becoming wetter in the eastern Chesapeake Bay watershed. Sea level, because this doesn't impact you all that much, I'll kind of rush past it, but basically suffice it to say, sea level, like I said, Virginia has some of the worst sea level rise in the entire world. It's getting worse. It has big impacts on coastal flooding, it has big impacts on ecosystems and shorelines, habitats, groundwater intrusion, salinization, and erosion, right? So all these things, sea level rise is pretty significant. Now we're getting onto some of those risk chapters I mentioned prior. So heat risk, obviously temperature increasing, I think it's kind of intuitive that heat risk is also going to be a concern. We're getting significant health impacts due to heat risk. There's also heat stresses, not just on people, right? It's like hotter, so we're having more heat stroke, but it also impacts our infrastructure and our built environment. I think in this example, for me at least, is when you look at the roads deteriorate more quickly when it's hotter outside, which means that we have to spend more money fixing those roads, and that's not a good equation, right? Everything just sort of impacts itself. Finally, this extreme heat also impacts ecosystems. I think a good example of this is like pests, ticks have a bigger season now, right? But we don't go too much into the detail of that in this actual assessment just yet. So, flood risk also really bad. Coastal flooding is of course very, very bad because of sea level rise. Pluvial and riverine flooding are also pretty bad. For those unaware, pluvial basically just means precipitation, just means rainfall. So if it rains, it might flood in places that aren't just rivers. You might get flooding upstream somewhere or in the mountains or whatever. Riverine flooding is when a river gets full, usually from upstream influences, and then it overtopples the sides of the river. Both of those are getting worse, causing widespread damages. Intense and frequent rainfall is also causing land use changes, aging stormwater infrastructure. There are a lot of things that we're doing that are making this worse, and that are making the impacts of rain worse on flooding and on river areas. And then finally, we have this thing, compound flood risk, similar to the compound hazards of the big spill. You might not just get like riverine flooding, you might get it when you're also getting storm at the same time, which of course means that those two risks compound and you get bigger floods. Drought risk is, I think, one of the more interesting ones because when we think drought, at least when I think drought, I often will just think about the West Coast, right? Where they have these very long-term, serious droughts. Well, we tend to have more frequent, shorter-term droughts, particularly in the last 25 years. And we call these flash droughts, similar to sort of flash floods. And these are particularly dangerous because they're very hard to predict, and that space is advancing, but they're so hard to predict, and even when we can predict them, we don't have very much lead time because they come on so quickly. So there's not much opportunity for us to react and to improve the situation. We're just sort of improving our awareness of flash droughts, but it's still hard to actually improve the situation, right? And droughts, I think, very obviously impact things like agriculture, but also impact forestry, water resources, and even the data center industry, which is pretty big in Virginia. Finally, compound risks. This is just sort of a mix of a lot of stuff, but basically we have weather extremes often causing power outages. We have rising temperatures can actually interact with distant pollution sources and cause us to have worse air quality here. And then also there's additional, like I mentioned, flooding. Flooding happens, it can lead to storm or during storm-driven events, and that can overwhelm our infrastructure. So if you have a flood that's making some of the roads inaccessible, all of a sudden you have less infrastructure than you had before, right? So fewer roads to actually respond to the emergency. And sometimes storms will also cause power outages, which might cause emergency systems to go down. Really, so everything is just interconnected, is what this chapter is about. And the next one, like I mentioned, I think this is a pretty cut and dry chapter. Everybody's impacted in different ways and different amounts, but everybody's impacted. This chapter has some really cool plots of like how specifically different economic sectors are impacted by different risks that I'd recommend you honestly just read because it's kind of hard to summarize. These bullet points kind of all say the same thing, just that all economic sectors are impacted at its fast. Now I'm going to go a little bit more into Charlottesville and sort of larger Albemarle with what we have, keeping in mind that because this is at these 6 climate divisions lumps, that we don't have as much.
No, I asked you to go back to the critical, the last point. So, you did that?
Yes.
What actually was it critical?
This. Yes.
And critical infrastructure. Is that?
One of the most important facts of climate change on Virginia's economic sectors is its impact on critical infrastructure, which underpins a functioning economy. So this is, like I said, with roads, for example, right? If roads go down, that's critical infrastructure that then becomes less. It's like one example, right? Droughts impacting data centers, that become kind of critical, one could argue, right? Floods and droughts impacting food, agriculture, right?
Power outage.
Extreme heat.
Power outage.
Yeah, what?
Blackout, power outage.
Yes, sorry, yes.
Also, just rail infrastructure can be warped by heat.
Yeah, we have projected to that. I used to have a picture of that on the slides. I don't know if I still do. But yes, that's a good one. Okay, so zooming into Charlottesville, as I mentioned, y'all are part of this Western Piedmont, this darkest green in the bottom middle here, which is basically the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, right? The Blue Ridge basically runs along that western edge. And you have you probably know this, but you have the highest population of that entire little region. Charlottesville and Albemarle County particularly is really like where the people live in this entire region for the most part. There are of course people for the south, but this is the centroid of the population. That's what I want to talk about on this slide. Next slide. Yes. Now looking at temperature specifically, we can look at this map. This is July average temperatures. It's also one for January in the climate assessment. I just want to point out that we get a lot colder weather, I mean not a lot colder, but colder by comparison to the rest of Virginia on the western side in the mountains, hotter weather down near Norfolk and Richmond and down in the southeastern part, and you all in the middle, you kind of get the middle. You're just your middle level temperature in Virginia. We also, this plot on the left is just showing daily lows, daily highs in the warmer and colder months. Or daily lows and highs in every single month for the past 30 years. I just pulled it out, not to talk details about it, but just to show that we happen to have this figure in there, and it's for Charlottesville. So you have a free figure in the Virginia Climate Assessment, just by I share that. And then something else kind of unique to Charlottesville is that, I mean, Thomas Jefferson, I think you all know who that is. He's pretty famous around these parts. He started measuring climate because, at least in my mind, he's kind of a climate nerd. And in 1776, he started getting measurements in Monticello, which I thought might have been pronounced Monticello. I go back and forth. I've been told that it's Monticello with Shane, Virginia, so that's what I'm going to say.
Play the cello.
Oh, yeah, it does Monticello, yeah. I go back and forth on that. But okay, Monticello.
Yes.
Thomas Jefferson's been collecting data in Monticello since 1776 up till 1826. I think the figure on the right is kind of interesting. Just basically what this shows is a lot of different years, and if there are measurements, and however many measurements there are in that region. Monticello has the most Thomas Jefferson measurements, period, across anywhere. Washington, D.C. is next. After that is Paris. And there are a couple other places where he took quite a few measurements, but you'll have a lot of cool data from Thomas Jefferson from 1772 to 1826. And on the left here, that figure is actually in the Virginia Climate Assessment, showing Monticello temperatures from 1776 to 1792 compared to Albemarle County temperatures from 2000 to 2024. And you can see just from that curve, there's evidence of 8 degrees Fahrenheit warming comparing now to 250 years ago. So I think that's pretty incredible that we have the data to be able to compare that. And you are lucky because you happen to have that data here. Okay. What's that? Heat risk, as I mentioned, is important. You do not have more heat risk than much of Virginia. Western Piedmont has more heat risk than the southwestern and central mountain regions because they're colder. The rest of the state has a little bit more heat risk than you are. These spots all show cooling degree days, which are kind of sort of like an approximation of energy needed to cool temperatures down to like livable average levels. And takeaway here is right. You're third lowest or fourth highest in Virginia when we rank climate division, so you're in the middle again. But it's still a significant amount. 18 degrees Celsius days per decade is still pretty big, which is roughly 32.4 Fahrenheit degrees days per decade. And of course, heat risk leads to lots of things, right? Higher mortality, hospitalization, blackouts, like you mentioned, and heat waves, spell strength. Precipitation also is interesting. So first, I want to look at this map on the top right. You'll see Charlottesville's actually labeled right in the middle there, and you're in this sort of light green color, which means you have kind of average precipitation, but it's a little bit higher than much of the north and much of the mountain region, except on the ridge of the mountains, which makes sense. Rain often falls on mountains. And southeast gets a lot of rain, and southwest also gets a lot of rain. But you have decent amounts of rain, and this Western Piedmont region actually generally experiences very humid summers and moderate winters. We also have summers that have been getting drier over the past century, which sort of feels a little bit counterintuitive, but doesn't necessarily mean it's not raining more, it's just getting drier. Precipitation is also expected to increase in Virginia up to 30%, which is a huge amount, especially in the winter time. The 30% numbers are a little further to the north. That's this second figure here. You can't really read it, but winter's in the top left, followed by spring, then summer on the bottom, and then fall on the bottom right. And the darkest blues are in the northwestern part of the Commonwealth. Those areas are expected to see 30% increases in precipitation when we're comparing baseline of, it says at the bottom here, 1976 to 2005 baseline compared to future. So 2035 to 2065 under RCP 8.5, which is like a bad case emission scenario.
That's going to affect the change in the Potomac rivers.
Sorry?
That's going to affect the
Yes,
change
it
in the
will.
Potomac rivers.
No, of course.
Because that's their headwaters.
Yeah, it's going to affect the James of the Potomac coming down, yes. And it's also going to affect everywhere else just in terms of not riverine, but also fluvial flooding. Can you go back for just a second if there might have been one thing I wanted to say? Yes, the last thing is just that not only is it raining more and it's raining more frequently and it's raining more intensely when it does rain, but we're also getting a statistically significant increase in consecutive wet days. So if it rains, it's becoming more likely to rain the next day and the next day. Okay, my next test. Oops. August. Now, storm impacts and flooding, I just grabbed the FEMA map, which is, for those unaware, FEMA only shows riverine flooding. They don't show fluvial, they don't show coastal, it's just rivers. This is just in Charlottesville riverine flooding, like you have some flooding extents. I don't know exactly how bad it looks like here, but I suspect fluvial is a pretty significant impact that we want to be looking into a little bit more. And FEMA sadly doesn't capture that. There are some new tools, I wish I'd put this on here, I thought about it later, but there is a new Fathom data set available for basically the whole state of Virginia. The state has purchased the Fathom data, which is flood estimates. I think it's rasterized at its depth on those gridded cells. I don't know if that means anything to you, but it's flood data for the whole of the state, and it includes precipitation-based flood risk. So a new data set that's worth considering and looking into.
What about organizations like First Street?
First Street is similar idea. They also publish stuff like that. Fathom, I think, is a little bit more legit, but still suffers from being, they do large, Fathom basically does big scale flood models and they sell them to all different states. First Street kind of tries to do similar stuff. So they suffer from a little bit of insufficient granularity when you're looking at like local places. Like if we go local somewhere we compare, you can use that as a reference to say, yeah, okay, I think we're doing a decent job. But then we often find new things.
So they're basically overselling their ability to predict what the locals.
I mean, they do it in a similar way to how we're doing it anyway. They just have to simplify it, and then they're doing it with big data sets that cover everywhere instead of being able to look at local data sets. And I think for flooding in particular, local knowledge is very important. Like making a map, showing it to somebody who lives there and being like, is this right? And then people can correct you. And then you end up actually having to tweak quite a bit sometimes. So flooding is really important to do. I think flooding is very important to do local scale. And so I think we get some information from these bigger picture studies, but only so much. Yeah. Looking at droughts, I think this is actually a pretty interesting thought on the top. I'm going to explain it. This is from year 2000 up to 2026. And basically, wherever it's white, we're not in a drought condition in Charlottesville, specifically for Charlottesville. Where it's red, we're in like near worst case drought scenario. And so what it's showing is that over time, we're seeing like some droughts. There was a really big deal, bad drought in 2002 that many of you are probably familiar with. After that, it was a little bit more sparse. We were getting some droughts here and there, but if you look at the end of this curve, we're seeing a lot more droughts, and they're not always lasting so long. Like they're short, and they happen, and they go away, and they come back, and they go away, and they're still pretty severe. On the bottom right, there's also a cool figure. This is a cool figure. It's kind of a sad figure from 2024. Looking just at June 4th, and then 2 weeks later is the picture on the upper right. 2 weeks after that is the bottom left, and 2 weeks after that is the right side on the bottom. So this is just a 6-week difference between basically no significant drought across the entire Commonwealth to basically a serious drought pretty much everywhere in the Commonwealth, right? And Albemarle, of course, is in the middle of here. You can maybe see if you're familiar with the shape, going from this white color to a tan color to an orange color, which is, the orange color is D2 drought, which means severe drought. So you were hit pretty significantly even in this case, and you're seeing the red line on the very farthest side on this top plot means that Charlottesville is actually in extreme drought, I think maybe right now, or maybe just was. I'm not exactly sure of today's information. But we do have a fair bit of drought. And then something else cool that maybe some of you are familiar with, this was, I actually noticed this in the Albemarle document. VDEQ leads a Virginia drought monitoring task force that's been around, I think they've been around for a couple of decades actually, for a bit. And this basically they update this web page, this map every week, and it shows you drought conditions across, I think it's 9 or 13 or something of their little groupings. And you can look in the very middle one, that's where you all fall. And I just wanted to explain this little indicator status. This picture is from their webpage like 4 days ago. The square in the middle, the top left shows precipitation. You see this gray square on in the figure as well. Precip is precipitation. Groundwater is the top right. Reservoir is res on the bottom left, and then flow is stream flow on the bottom right. And you'll see that you actually have really emergency status when it comes to precipitation right now. You have warning status, which is the second worst for groundwater levels right now. Reservoir levels actually seem okay, apparently, and your stream flow is in this watch status. So there's a lot of bad going on, and that leads to an overall warning status across almost all of Virginia, except for the one part of Virginia that has the most rain. Right? So this is a good tool. I recommend you look into it and use it. Finally, this is just a sort of shameless personal plug because I think we actually do pretty cool work. And I don't know how much information you know about flooding in this area. We've been I've been co-teaching a class with Celso Ferreira, who's a full professor at the University of Virginia, who also does a lot of flood work. We basically teach combined undergrad and graduate student course to develop two-dimensional flood models, use those to post-process flood information, and then create ArcGIS story maps. I have some examples. I don't want to go into them unless people are interested. I figure we can ask some questions first. But I think the students do a really good job with this and create really cool story maps that then sometimes the stakeholders we're working with can take to apply for grants or take to engineering consulting firms to say, here's sort of our preliminary understanding, can you work from here with our understanding of how flooding is impacting this part that's very important to us. And the way this works is that honestly, if you are interested, you can just submit a request online and we can query it with the student group and we can do flood models. I think that would be really cool. And we've been developing the course for 3 years, so this will be our 4th year doing it. And as I was mentioning to Annette, I'm actually probably going to be out of a job by then, but I think this class will still exist, hopefully. And then the next 2 slides are just 2 examples of these story maps with links that I could click on and show you, but that would take a few more minutes. I don't want to rely on the internet. I'm happy to share these slides. You can click on these links and look at them yourself later if you'd like. The next slide is also another example. These are just 2 story maps. This is just a pretty picture with a link, really. The story map shows lots of different flood scenarios for an area, shows maybe the buildings that are impacted, the roads that are impacted, at what depth are they impacted, some possible mitigation strategies, like should we put a levee over here, should we put tidal gates over here. It's actually pretty comprehensive what the students managed to accomplish in the course. So that's why I'm sharing. They're pretty cool.
Elaborate a little bit more on the context. Is this the climate center doing this? And there's been a kind of an outward facing effort there with various communities. Right?
Yes and no. So the climate center it's very aligned with the climate center's mission, but technically this is funded under a different project called the STRIP project. I hate the acronym, but STRP, it's I forget even what it stands for, but it's for teaching basically. It's for basically doing exactly this, making courses that do have like real world components, ideally some kind of stakeholder involvement. The students interact with the stakeholder at least once, maybe twice during the semester with like a video voice call to say, hey, are we doing it right? Yeah, it's really cool. There's also a similar course that is being developed around heat risk also. So we have that too. If you think those things are of interest, they do exist. And that's it. That's all I have. I know it's kind of a long presentation, but that's all I've got. You can scan these QR codes if you don't know where the first Virginia Climate Assessment is. You can get the QR code on the left, or you can just Google for it. And on the right, you can sign up to receive emails from the Virginia Climate Center if that is also of interest. That's all I have.
So we've got a number of good questions in chat, but let's start with the in-person first. Anyone have a question for Dr. Poole?
Not so much a question as a comment. One of my friends is a farmer, but for the last 3 years, his hay crop has been cut by 50% because of a drought in March and April. If he doesn't get rain in March and April, he loses half of his hay crop. And that's what I used to be talking about with these flash droughts.
Yeah, fun. So I think they're really interesting. I didn't really know that much about them before I looked into them about this chapter. I have some experience with drought, but flash droughts is sort of newer in the lingo of slates as far as I'm concerned. I think it's been around for a bit, but in more niche spaces. And they're really serious because yeah, if a flash drought comes, you don't have time to prepare, and because it's so quick, the climate also doesn't really have time to adjust. So in a long-term drought, as terrible as they are, the landscape, the environment starts to kind of adjust and learn how to deal with it a little bit. Flash droughts, it doesn't happen. Like it just happens, the drought happens, you get the serious impacts, you lose your crop, or half of it, or however much of your crop you lose, and then all of a sudden it's not a drought anymore, but it's too late. Right?
You seem to be having more of them though.
We are having more of them. Yeah, they're having more.
So it's connected with just the overall warming of the climate.
Yes, and another question that maybe I'm gonna get, I think it's a great question, is like how can we possibly be getting more rain and more floods and more drought? How does that make sense, right? And it kind of goes both ways. Basically, the way that I like to think about it is essentially that the water cycle is just getting faster. And so instead of like gradual rain and then gradual dry periods, we're just getting rain, dry, rain, dry, rain. We're getting lots of peaky stuff, right? So we get the rain all of a sudden. If we get the rain all of a sudden, we often will get too much rain, and that rain will then run off, and it won't be absorbed by the soil. So we actually end up with drier soil, even though it's more rain, if it's all at once, right? The converse is also true. The converse is also true. When we have dry soil, it becomes so dry that it becomes actually hydrophobic. So when water falls, it can't absorb it anymore because it's kind of like pump. It just doesn't accept the water anymore. And dry conditions cause vegetation to dry. Vegetation slows down water, so it prevents that. Everything is tied in together, and actually these things cause each other in a sort of seemingly unintuitive way, but it actually does make sense.
So actually, this is connected to a question from Carolyn. She made the point that temperatures have been spiking in other places in the world, such as she cites Pakistan, where they had a reading recently of 124.7 Fahrenheit. And that's in the report. There's a section dealing with wet bulb temperatures. The effect of humidity with more moisture in the atmosphere is going to be very important when you talk about heat and human health, because it's really that wet bulb temperature that determines the survivability.
Experience, yeah.
But so Carolyn's question is, how long until we reach similar thresholds in achieve?
That's a question I don't know.
Repeat the question. Repeat the question for
So question basically highlighting how wet bulb temperatures are important when we're thinking about temperature, but also looking at places like Pakistan where we're having recent temperature readings as high as 124 Fahrenheit. That makes sense. Celsius would be crazy. 124 Fahrenheit, and how that basically the question is how long until Virginia gets to that point. The honest answer is I don't know. I'm not a temperature expert. But I think we have curves that could show when that would happen. I just don't know off the top of my head when.
Just anecdotally, I watched a presentation based in Virginia, Michigan, about the climate in Detroit, and the projections were by 2080, Detroit would have the same climate as Atlanta.
Yeah, great. Well, how do we move north? We actually had a question on ours. What the question was.
Yeah, question is a question. I was interested in your framing of drought, particularly one of the things that you were talking about drought impacting was the data center industry, and I know everyone in this room saw that one, and I'm just curious about your inclusion of that, and if you could talk a bit more about sort of why you included that framing in that way, and just how it impacts the data center industry and how we should consider those for the planet.
Yeah, so
Yes.
I want to forget that every time. Question is basically, I said droughts impact the data center industry, and I elaborate. It's basically what the question is there. I think the sort of obvious way is drought basically means we have issues with water availability, which then water is used usually for cooling of data centers, and so we have less of that water to cool data centers, right? And the temperature of water also is, of course, impacted in a negative way, but that's something. Trying to remember what else about that.
I think I was asking about the choice to frame it in that way.
Sure. Okay. And the other question, part of the question was about the framing of including data centers as part of, I guess, the narrative of in the climate assessment. truly the reason that we're including it there is because it is such a big hot button issue in Virginia. So to say like, look, we get a lot of positive media, people like trying to sell data centers and talk about how good they are. There are negative things to be thinking about. And we have, I know one of my colleagues recently gave a talk about some of the five like top negative things about data centers. I think in Virginia, I will find that and I'll share it with you because that might be of interest. But basically just to highlight that data centers, I hesitate to say this because I'm genuinely not as familiar with the space as I would like to be. I haven't looked into all of the pieces of data centers, but to my knowledge, data centers have some pretty significant negative climate impacts. And I'm politically not even supposed to talk about all that sometimes too, like, because I don't even know what's gonna get me in trouble. But I think suffice it to say that we put it in there to try to call attention to it because it is an important consideration that I think we're starting to talk about, but it's still not talked about enough.
And
Hopefully that.
It's state facts.
Yeah, it's facts, of course, absolutely.
Well, I noticed, I mean, in the state assessment, in the section on Northern Virginia, you talk, the report talks about flooding that has basically shut down critical infrastructure with the data center demand for power and water in those, extreme situations. Isn't that going to compound the effects on the local community?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Data centers take a lot of resources, and that puts
those resources, water being, I think, a big one. I obviously am obsessed with water, given that I've studied it in my own career. Water is, in my opinion, the most critical resource we have, and data centers do in fact use a lot of it. It is withdrawals, not strict use, but then it gets put back into the environment, has negative impacts on changing the temperature of the water. It takes it out of the system temporarily while it's being used for cooling purposes. Yeah, data center. I wish I knew more to talk more in depth about data centers, but I'm also a little bit concerned about my future career.
You mentioned the climate center, Ian talked about the hoped for role there and the importance of having a climate office, especially at the state level. Can you give a sense of what the future of the climate center program at George Mason might be, could be? They're hoping it will be?
Yes. I think information there is, we don't have as much information as we want. We've been working, we keep hoping and thinking we're going to be written into the state budget. I'm not certain. I think we've got news that that's likely. I don't know that I've kept seeing anything.
The current state budget that we're still talking about?
Yes,
that one. So
yes, we've got sort of whispers that perhaps we will be included in the state budget. That keeps getting pushed back. And however, I think that even if we are written into the state budget, we are anticipating a budget of $0. So we are also simultaneously looking at applying to lots of grants. We had a few grants in place that we were hoping we would get that we did not get. That's part of the reason I'm going to be out of a job, is because we just did not get the funding to support the climate office, right? So we're in the process of still trying to do this. I think there are a few other grants that we might hear about in October, might hear about in December. We're waiting to hear more information. We're continuing to apply to things, but the straight up answer is I don't know. I think the goal is for the Virginia Climate Center to sort of become the state climate office. Our hope is to host the climate office at George Mason. That is the goal. I think that also might cause some of the tensions with other universities, because technically UVA have the state climatologist hosted here. We used to have a state climate office. It was one person, and then he stopped doing it, and then we didn't have one anymore. I forget his name, but
Pat Michaels.
I don't think that was
It was a guy after.
Yeah, that's something.
Well, this gets to an issue. Why wasn't UVA involved in this? Why is this such? This is the second question. Why is this such a touchy issue? Because of our recent governor?
I think so. Well, partly. I think it's governor, but also just politics period. Climate stuff is hard. We had another project in George Mason that basically was about climate education type stuff, and we had to scrub the entire project to not include the word climate. And so now the entire project, everybody working on it is kind of unsure about what exactly the goal is, because it's been so scrubbed, right? And I think that that's happening across the board. And I think that when we wrote this a year ago, it was a little bit more up in the air. It's still a lot in the air. But I think people were concerned about working with Virginia Climate Center, right? Because climate's in our name. I think that might be part of it. And then I think that also George Mason doesn't just don't really have like a big slice of the steak pie, so to speak, right? It's mostly tech and the VA. And so I think there might be some hesitations that I think it's some scarcity mindset thinking at the end of the day. I think it's concerns that their slices of the pies might get smaller. To be honest though, I don't know all the inner workings there. I just know that I reached out to multiple colleagues, people that I have worked with personally in the past at UVA to try to get them involved in this document even. And they basically said no. And I think it might have had a little bit, I suspect it had a little bit more to do with university level politics than necessarily with interest, because these are people who I reached out to who I thought would be very interested.
You were just going to the East School? About environmental science?
I think we reached out to some environmental science folks. I personally went more to the East School because those are the folks that I know, but I know that we reached out to a number of UVA folks helping get them involved. And we had one person serve as a reviewer from the UVA from the East School. But that was it. I mean, it's also, part of it was also short timeline, but we're really just trying to get this out to sort of show it as a prototype and put information out there that we think is important. And so we really just try to push it out, and when people were not responsive or were unavailable, we just move forward, right? And I think that doesn't preclude people from being involved in the future. Very much the goal is, and there are discussions already ongoing with people from the UVA, from UTAC, from America, from all the universities, as many universities across Virginia as we can get involved, talking about, well, how do we want to approach this politically? Who wants to be involved in more ways? Those conversations are happening. Mostly above my pay grade level, those conversations are happening, but they are happening. And so I'm hopeful that going forward, we'll have a little bit more sort of better representation across the state, because that was the dream initially, and we realized that it didn't feel feasible given that our timeline was so aggressive, and we were aiming to get it done by October, November, so that we could try to push this idea again in the state budget. So it was kind of a strict timeline on short.
So there are other states that have been more robust in supporting climate assessments in the recent.
Yes. I don't know details about a lot of them, but I do know that New York has very good. They're really set up. I think they're on like their fourth or fifth one right now. We're on the fourth maybe, fifth. And we had one of the lead authors, one of the other collaborating authors on this project with me, Ruess, is a sort of a young professor at George Mason, and he contributed to one of those in the past and has a lot of connections there. So we tried to learn a lot from them. There are multiple iterations in, and I'm sure other places. I don't know all the different states and what they're doing, but
It's in California.
yeah, California, I would imagine, is pretty far along, but yes, we're on our first. And we are, like I said, we're one of 2 states that does not have a state climate office, which I think is like so embarrassing to be honest.
So just want
Should
to
I take more of the room first? Or
let's we'll get to Tom next in the room, but I just wanted to note that on the chat, and I want to thank her for being on the chat, Ann Malik, who's supervisor of the Whitehall District in Albemarle County, just remarked that in northwestern Albemarle County, which is points to the importance of locality when you're talking about drought. She says that in northwest Albemarle County, the agricultural systems are dry, lake outputs are a trickle, streams are almost dry.
great. I mean, yeah, it's not surprising. So
Tom, yeah.
also less snow means we have less water in store for some also.
I just wanted to ask you, I made a comment and then asked this was to be included in the future analyses of, as a biologist, 10 years ago, some of us were working on Balmoral County biodiversity plan. And we had a speaker from Virginia Tech online. And she presented a bunch of models of expected range shifts of various native species of trees and some birds that flew over in Virginia. And in fact, even 10 years ago, it was anticipated that you would have some species quite massive shifts. And for example, some species that are adapted to high altitude that live up in mountains, the usual adaptation is to climb up higher. But as we keep going higher and higher, the land area, the habitat area would smell and smell, and eventually you run out of us. And so there were species also that were expected to become extinct in Virginia. So there's going to be really major shifts in species moving, going extinct, and no doubt coming in from North Carolina or other places. And it affects agriculture as well, I would say, as a grazer. Most of the captive species we have in central Virginia here, they're sort of food season species from Europe originally, and they're just not adapted to kind of time changeable, very hot, very dry weather, which we're steadily moving into. And one of the big challenges to agriculture along with the short term is I think you're going to have to see a lot of adaptation into after species mixes. Whether some, for example, sheep are parasite prone, we have some. It's even much of the south because parasite loads are everything. That's going to be much more. So you're saying there's a vast variety of impacts on natural systems and biodiversity and agriculture. And I hope you all will be able to look at that next.
Yes, I think that's a great thing to highlight. I admittedly, we have not looked into that very much at all, as you can tell. I think also looking a little bit more into agriculture especially would be really helpful. But again, it's the kind of thing that politically, maybe Virginia Tech should lead that chat. I don't really know. We're still sort of navigating how best to bring everybody together, right, to do these kinds of things. But I think that's a really good highlight, and I'm looking that back because we have sort of this list of things that we may miss, and I'm not actually sure that really looking at the biology and the migration of species is making really on this yet. So I'm gonna double check. That's really good. That's good. Yeah.
That's very important because the central appellation is a hugely important area for animal migrations.
Oh yeah, I've seen some of those maps. It's really cool. Yeah.
So Ron McGinnis of Piedmont Environmental Council his organization was involved in the production of the Albemarle County Resilience Plan, and that plan was also presented by a county and some city staff. And as I recall, in their report, agricultural damages was the most serious economic vulnerability for the county. I mean, you went to Illinois, which is pretty renowned for agricultural research, environmental research. So what is your assessment of
like where it's going to be the most fit?
In agriculture?
I mean, the answer is I don't know. We didn't really do that, right? We did some drought assessment stuff, but we didn't look too much into which specific crops were being affected. I would love to have done that, but we had basically part of the reason that this document is so limited is because it's first version, so we were just trying to get it out quick. But because we were trying to get it out quick and do like a high level first version, we had very strict limits on how much content could be included. So every chapter, those authors had to agree on 3 key messages, 25 words each, supported by I think like 500 or 600 words, which is like nothing. So we had very limited real estate to really like explain what's going on in the state. And we also had an agreed upon decision of which chapters we're going to do because we know we have people who can confidently lead them. So that was a constraint. We don't have, as much as it makes me so sad because I studied irrigation and crop water use when I was at Illinois in my PhD. I love it. I think it's so cool. We don't really have that yet.
So, but the national assessment from 2023 is pretty detailed on a lot of topics, including agriculture. But is the message that you need an assessment every year, every couple of years to really stay up to date?
We can dream, right? I think it'd be great to have an assessment like this every like 2-3 years at a minimum, just to sort of keep track of what's going on. And for me also, I hope that this assessment can serve somewhat as also a bit of a call to action to get a little bit more granular data at Virginia's level figured out. Because honestly, precipitation chapter, we have good precip data that's like highly spatially variable, but we have like maybe 1 or 2 like solid precip references. Drought chapter, I had almost nothing to really work with in terms of references that look at Virginia, because this flash drought stuff is new. Like there was a decent amount of stuff talking about southeastern region, but most drought literature is talking about California, right? So I think we're missing, actually, because it's the state of the science review, we're not doing new information. We're just taking information that exists and then we're collecting it. That was our directive here. Maybe future climate assessments could start to create more information. That's the kind of thing that I think a state climate office would maybe be equipped to start doing. But we, as a bunch of volunteers on a 6-month timeline, just didn't have that kind of resource available. So there was no new data created. We're just relying on what's available.
I just want to make an editorial comment. I think it's really disappointing that the state is not stepping up on a state climate office.
I agree.
It's given everything that's happening at the federal level.
Right. That was also part of our motive.
It's really disappointing. We had a quick question from Everest. You just want to know what is the level of detail for the various regions, pretty equivalent. And he specifically cited the Central Mountain region. Like, how would you assess that?
Do you repeat the question?
Yeah, right. Repeat the question.
So,
Level of detail for the different regions, the 6 climate divisions, is it approximately equivalent or some more or less representative than others? Is the question. In corralling and coordinating all the chapter authors, we were very explicit saying, please do call out to the climate divisions. This is our scale of reference for this document. Please use these terms, call out specific insights for these areas. Not every chapter did that. So some chapters don't even have that. They just have like maps and sort of general takes. Maybe they talk about northern, maybe they talk about central, but they don't talk about the climate divisions by name. So it's kind of hard to tell when we have that kind of spread. And the climate divisions themselves, I know that the chapters I was involved in, I tried to specifically call out every single climate division and what's going on there. But some chapters will only call out 1 or 2 when there's like specifically stuff going on. So there might be a little bit of a skew here or there. If there's a skew, I suspect it's either towards northern or towards like southeast. Just because there are some like the sea level chapter, of course, is going to focus on Norfolk because that is where we have it so bad, right? That's what I'm talking about. So I don't know. I think representation was as good as we could get it. We tried to convince people to really like focus on the whole Commonwealth as a whole, but I don't know. When you're a scientist, it's like fun to focus on the sexy worst case scenario. Right?
So, that's sometimes the bias, the costs as well.
Yes.
Yeah, I just want to say, I know Jessica Whitehead with Old Dominion University.
Yeah, just
the Old Dominion University and BIMS, the Institute of Marine Science, they for numbers of years have been working on gathering data for the coastal areas. So that they have just been doing that for 10, 20 years, really. So there's been a lot of support for that because they've had such an obvious and severe economic impact that actually the state actually said, oh, we need to study that. We need reports on that. So that has a longer history than what's been gathered as far as data and in-depth analysis of the state. But that's why it's important that you all have done this, looking at all the regions of the state. And it's very important to continue on with making sure we get the other regions because there's a lot of agriculture and forestry in the whole rest of the state also. I mean, the big cities are the coastal, right? But agriculture is number 1, forestry number 3 for our state for private income. So it's private businesses, and so those are very important. And having heard from the Secretary of Treasury, the new Secretary of Agriculture, she's very supportive, and I think also with the governor's office, very supportive of working on doing whatever they can to support the farming community. So if you all want to do studies,
I think we would love to.
Maybe you need to. I would suggest talk to them because whatever they have, I don't know what kind of funding they have, but whatever they could support you all in doing, might be a positive move there.
I do remember in many of our conversations, especially early, we talked about, I would often bring up agriculture and would often not be shut down, but be told like, you really tread carefully, that's Virginia Tech's territory, so the politics come into play where it's like, can we or can we not? Like, yes, it's part of the climate, but maybe we shouldn't do it. Feels weird, right? But there is some of that also going on. And I think, like I said, people are starting to finally like convene and talk about like, can we work through this mess because this is silly? Yes. I'm hopeful that the progress will be made, but I think we can sometimes be a little bit slow. And so we'll see if that progress can be made, but I'm hopeful. Yeah.
So we do have some good people coming to the table from lots of different institutions. Some will be. That was also good.
So I just wanted to apologize. It was Carolyn who asked the question about regional equivalents. One last question from the chat. I'm going to wrap it up in about 5 minutes.
Question audience.
First from the chat though, Janine
talked about you mentioning that New York has good climate data, but are there other regions where the academic literature has been active on climate analysis at a regional level? If not necessarily state governments, are there like hotspots for research
Oh,
on a regional
question is, are there hotspots for research for climate data across the US, not just because I mentioned New York earlier? What I mentioned about New York is not necessarily saying they have good climate data, it's just that they have been doing consistent climate assessments that are high quality. That's a little bit different. And I mean, I think a lot of it is just going to follow the disasters, to be honest. Like, I think if you look at the whole country, probably California has the best wildfire research. Just guessing, but I'm pretty sure I'm right? And earthquakes, or maybe Montana too, right? And earthquakes and stuff like that, right? So I think some of that, like, I know a lot of the drought research that's really good comes out of Nebraska. We happen to have a very good institute there that does even like the national scale stuff. So there's pockets and there's the Corn Belt, makes sense, right? There's pockets, but short answer, I don't really know. I'm not familiar with all the different forms of literature and where they are geospatially, but I think probably yes, but I think it depends more on like what the highlighted concerns are there. So for example, back to sea level rise, I think Virginia has pretty good sea level rise research because it's a really big deal. So it makes sense that we have easy literature to find to use in our assessment.
What about insurance companies? Is there any like private?
The question was about what about insurance companies? Also not really my space, but this person who does heat risk, who's like more of a heat risk expert, younger professor at George Mason, his name is Ruess Ortiz. He just got a big grant to start working more with insurance companies and reinsurance companies specifically to do climate stuff. So there is, I think, a big demand there. There's also insurance companies like whatever, what's that one, Truvia, whatever it's called. All these insurance companies have like their own flood models and fire models and stuff like that. I don't really know the weeds there. I'm not particularly interested in insurance companies. I'm a little more interested in the climate sake. But I know that there's a big demand there.
Hey, they're sending a message by increasing pretty message across the nation.
Yeah, it's true.
Even in mid-continent like Iowa.
Oh, we have a question.
Yeah, there's a question in the back. Who had the question?
You.
Sorry.
Yes.
Let me go.
I think we.
Great.
Someone, please.
Okay. Data centers were the largest market in the world, so it makes sense.
Yeah.
But
Yes,
it's pretty reckless to get that, I think. But so with the assessment, what's the vision for these assessments? Because their assessments are really only as good as their implementation plans. So who takes the baton from here?
We don't have, right?
It literally, that would be it's not,
Yes.
if academia gives you the assessment and then the legislation gives you the.
Even academia doesn't necessarily give you the assessment. Climate offices aren't always academics. A state climate office usually has a state climatologist, maybe it has a team. North Carolina has one of the best state climate offices. They have like 17 people, which is crazy. Other places it's like one person, like we used to have. It's just one person who does like some climate stuff. I don't even know exactly what their responsibilities are, there's only one of them, right? But one is better than zero. I think our hope is that if we can get some money, we have somebody who I think would be a good state climatologist. He's also one of the lead authors, Jim Pinter. He's precipitation expert. He's been around for a long time. Got a lot of climate modeling. I think he'd be great for it. And then the idea would be to hire someone like me to do like research work, and then another person to do more communications. We have somebody else in the team. Her name is Alice Fox. Very good in terms of like actually driving around all of Virginia, interacting with local municipalities, getting connected with people. I think some of you know Alice Fox. So we have some ideas of like what team members we might need to make a climate office successful. But I do think at the end of the day, climate assessment in theory, in our vision, would be something that a climate office would implement or study or put out every few years based on her scientific knowledge. They don't need the academics connections because they're not doing novel work for the most part. It's usually more of a collection of existing knowledge. Yeah, it's more of a literature, like a comprehensive literature. And then from there, yeah, like a implementation plan. We also talked about that early in our earlier drafts, but we just thought maybe we didn't know enough.
based off who was involved to really put together like a robust implementation, right? So the idea was, okay, whatever, scope down a little bit, just focus on the scope down from our 30-page estimate to a 90-page document, focusing just on climate, but scope down and worry about that with the next one and just get something out there because something is better than nothing, and we want to have the baseline. That was it. Like, this is not intended to be with the end all, it's just the first step, right? So we're hoping future ones could have implementation strategies. Maybe the implementation is something that, I don't know, logically, maybe it falls a little more on politicians or people who actually have the power to implement. But for now, yeah, we don't have the power, and we don't really think we have all the knowledge to be able to do that.
Well, and the parallel is there is now a resilience office, climate resilience office in the state that was created after many years of advocacy that the state legislation passed. It said there will be a state resilience officer for the state, but we also need this bigger umbrella of the climate office, and it really takes advocacy, from communities, localities, people, universities, because they have their own lobbyists, and some local governments and whatever, but to say this is important for us for economic reasons, for health reasons, for well-being of our citizens, etc. So yeah, it is a mess. This is why Cville100 thought it was really important to get this out here. This is its first step.
I appreciate it. Yeah.
Really first step to say it's technically possible to do, to set up a climate office. It's the political will. That's
and the money.
And the money.
I think to a certain extent, the report, the assessment underplays the risks of Virginia.
Because I don't think it talks a lot about atmospheric circulation patterns, which is research showing that they're becoming more static. Tropical systems are moving more slowly, and they're also becoming more intense in mid-latitudes. So, can you talk a little bit about that aspect, like tropical cyclones?
The question is cyclones and how patterns are changing, how we don't have any information about how patterns are changing. Right?
It doesn't seem to be played up that much in the report.
I mean, you're right, it's not played up. Right? Our focus is just sort of temperature increase at sea level, and then some of the impacts. I think it again just comes down to scope. We didn't really talk about it because we didn't have space. There's a little bit to think about in the show, if I remember correctly. But maybe I'm misunderstanding the question. But the answer is really just that yes, we have looked into it. It would be great to look into it.
It's just there's evidence showing the tropical weather, severe tropical impacts are shifting north.
Yes.
And that puts Virginia in the crosshairs.
Let's just see if there's any other questions that we can wrap up that.
No, I was just making sure.
Any last
We regretted that you didn't cover wildfire and disease issues. My very wooded community talked to the crisis managers here in Elmore County, and they said wildfire is your greatest risk. Route 250 is not likely to get cut by a flood, but if wildfire started in your community and there was a strong wind day, you get rid of across. So in the future, it's possible.
We would love to.
But also the other issue, a couple of years ago, smoke and those wildfires. But Charlottesville area into the purple category was dangerous to go outside. I walked in an electronic air filter, so that my air in my house is the same for me and my grandkids if people would take shelter. That's another economic cost, is that people to protect themselves from smoke from fires that aren't controllable to power.
Sure. No, I agree. And thank you for having it. We know it's a thing that we had to cut, basically, for lack of resources, essentially.
And I'm going to parallel again is the stage research that has gone on at Old Dominion University, but literally they've been doing research for 20 years. And when it started with a very fast thing, and then they have more in depth, and more in depth.
You have a lot of good coastal information.
Yes, there's a lot of good coastal information. And we do have, the state has the coastal master plan for climate management. And it was first cut, people said you left out X, Y, and Z things. They now, again, mandated by the state, by our legislature. There is phase 2 of that is wrapping up, I think. It was supposed to be done at the end of Youngkin's term, but it may be still wrapping up.
Yes.
And just FYI, there's also a statewide flood analysis in the works that again was supposed to have been done at the end of Youngkin's term, but I believe is still being wrapped up. But are you familiar with that? And that's going to be statewide. So that is going to be, this is Department of Conservation and Recreation at the state level
Okay, yeah.
doing those.
It's because, the CRFD, Coastal Resilience National Planning, what it stands for, we basically have sort of pre-built little flood models for half of the state. That is coastal, or less than half of the coastal region, right? And so then you have for other regions, it's a different point.
Right. Yeah, so Virginia, as you may know, moves slowly, but it's really important that we all keep the awareness up that we, community members, advocacy people, know what's going on and know where we need to go. And the models, again, pointed out, whether it's New York or Massachusetts or state of Maryland, North Carolina, they have, they all have climate plans, climate and resilience plans, actually, that we can take a look at and say, here's some, models here. Why aren't we doing things this way in our state? So it's up to us. Push the whole thing forward.
And on the note, I mean, I'm sure people are aware of what's been happening at the General Assembly or around the state budget. The news that's come out in the last day or two. So I encourage people to contact their representatives and talk about what they want to see happen. Because yes, it might move slowly, but it's very important not to go in reverse.
Yeah, right. That is. So, Peter, do you want to wrap it up?
Yeah, let's wrap it up. And then,
going forward, what Cville100 wants to do, and
well, we're going to keep people. One of the functions is to keep people abreast of what's happening at the state and local level. So we're going to keep people aware of what's happening, and we want to highlight the work of other area environmental organizations. And I see we have representatives from C3, PEC, Sierra Club. A lot of these organizations are following the issues very closely and doing great work on them. So please seek out those organizations as well. But we have monthly meetings, journal meetings, where we highlight issues where we think we can have a local and regional impact or try to coordinate actions to that effect. Really want to thank Dr. P for driving. The branch of Rudyard. He lives in DC.
I live in DC.
Drove from DC this afternoon to get here. So they got here at reasonably early times for us to
I wanted to take a train, but the only train options arrived here either at 10 in the morning or at like 7:30 p.m.
That's 2-3.
I needed a middle one.
So we need to, well, first of all, thanks for the participants on Zoom. Really appreciate your questions. Sorry for having to deal with some technical issues, but hopefully we can, in future meetings, clean that up. But thank you very much. I'm going to end the Zoom meeting now. People here, feel free to sample some of the refreshments on your way out and to mingle a little bit. What time, Diane, do we need to actually leave the building? Any specific time?
we need to leave here by 8:30.
Okay, so just hang out a bit, have some refreshments, ask further questions of these can be around for a bit.
Yes.
And really appreciate the turnout and the good questions and the obvious interest in the presentation.
Thanks.